Good afternoon, beautiful miracle workers. Thank you for coming today. So look, today John Mundy brought tons of versions of Course in Miracles, including a very brand new one. What does it mean? John will explain to us today. So it's so exciting and so interesting theme today, but let's remember there is no new thing to learn because truth is just one. But there are so many helpful things to remember the truth. So today is the one of the information. So let's have a great journey with John. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Han. So welcome. This is June 11th, 2017. And I do have a few announcements with regard to national kind of events that are coming up regarding A Course in Miracles. You have flyers, but you can also see this on our website if you go there. In just a few weeks, July 14th through 16th, there's an event that's in Utah, which is a fundraiser for the Foundation for Inner Peace, who's the publisher of A Course in Miracles. And there'll be quite a number of us there will be there talking about that. You've got a flyer about that. On the back of that flyer is an announcement about what I think is going to promise to be a really interesting retreat in North Carolina, October 5th through the 8th, with a great list of presenters, and my very favorite Course in Miracles bass singer, Donna Carey, will be there. And then there's another flyer about the international conference on the Course in San Francisco in February of next year. So that's all the announcements. I did it. Now you can see them on the website. What I'd like to do today is two things. One is there have been a lot of questions about why do we have so many different versions of A Course in Miracles. So I thought I would address that question because it's been asked so much. I also created little booklets about this. The booklets, you can also get the booklet online. I'll put it online for you to get. But it does get to be a little bit confusing, so I thought I'd just sort of go through the history of kind of what happened, and then that'll probably be pretty much the first hour. Then the second hour, we'll start talking about the 50 Miracles Principles, or we'll start talking about what a miracle is as well. So let's just go into here. And so I want to let you, where I'm gathering information for today's presentation comes really from three different sources. Absence from Felicity. Is anybody familiar with Absence from Felicity? Okay, Fran is, and you know. So Absence from Felicity was a book about Helen's life, who was written by Dr. Ken Wapnick. I forgot the year he wrote that, but it was quite a number of years, about 91, something like that, that came out. I think it was 91 that came out. It's very interesting. Helen was not your normal individual that we think of as scribing, taking down what the words of Jesus, nonetheless, what he would say. She was a very unlikely candidate in lots of different ways. First of all, she liked to think of herself as being atheistic in belief. However, as Ken once said to me, you know, Helen was no atheist. And she wasn't, right? And she just adopted this job. She didn't even know why she got it. But it seemed important that she was supposed to do this scribing. And she was actually the perfect person. In good part because she was a psychologist. And there's a lot of psychological journeying through the first part. talking about Freud and Jung and others. But Helen was also a genius level, so was her husband Louis, who I think I've told you before used to own an unsuccessful bookstore in Greenwich Village. And Helen tried to help him with that, but it was really found that not to be exciting. I think Louis sounds like somebody who always had his nose in a newspaper or a book, one of the two. So for that, then Ken also wrote an article which was titled The History of the Manuscript of A Course in Miracles. And if you want more detail than what I'm going to go into today, you can read that on, I think it's both Ken's website, the Foundation for A Course in Miracles, and on the website for the Foundation for Inner Peace. All right? And then, of course, there's what I know from having been active in discussions with Judy and Ken and Helen. As you know, I met Helen and Bill first in '73. I'll talk about that a little bit. And then how they formally introduced me to the Course in April of 1975. So I want to add in the beginning, I think it's important that it doesn't make any difference which edition of the Course in Miracles you read. And the reason why it doesn't make any difference is because it all says the same thing. It's just that in some of the earlier editions, we have a lot of extraneous material, a lot of stuff that actually Helen was very clearly told to take out. I'm going to go over what that was that they were asked to take out and why. What we have here, the bottom is the text. So the text was the original edition of the Course in Miracles. Right? Then we have what was called the Hugh Lynn Casey version, which is here. Now we have the annotated version that Robert Perry has produced, which is the whole thing based on Helen's original notes, plus, so that's the text plus commentary. And I think this is, what is it? We're on to the nature of, let's see, 1,100 pages, right? I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. So I prefer what would really be this edition, and I'll explain to you why this is the edition that is pretty clear to me that Jesus intended for us to read. That's not to say that you can't read the other editions. You know, there's nothing hidden. It's just that it was extraneous stuff. Right? We'll explain why it was extraneous. So my first book, which was called Learning to Die, I laid a copy out to bring with me, and it's still laying on the table. Was published by Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship in 1973. I found this old picture in the file. There I am at 29 years old giving a talk at the Barbizon Plaza. Not the Barbizon Plaza. We did Barbizon Plaza. This is the Bismarck Hotel in Chicago. And Helen and Bill came to this presentation. I don't think there are pictures in there, but Hugh Lynn Casey, who was Edgar Casey's son, was the keynote speaker at this particular event, right? And I do not know that Helen and Bill and Hugh Lynn had a session together at that time, but I cannot imagine their being in the same hotel at the same time with not having, they must have gotten together and talked about this, right? And so let's go on. So Helen and Bill actually prepared an edition of the text for Hugh Lynn. They were, you know, the way that these two came about was very similar. I mean, Hugh Lynn is also receiving the information that he got through, if you all know Edgar Casey rather, with the foundation down in Virginia Beach, the Association for Research and Enlightenment. There's some interesting overlaps and similarities, also some differences. Hugh Lynn would get information about physical health, about money, etc., things that the Course wouldn't just not be talking about, right? So they prepared what was, at that point, this edition, which was given to Hugh Lynn, which still contains some of the basic information about Bill and Helen and their relationship, etc. This was placed in the archives of the ARE library, and at some point, we don't know when or who, but that was stolen from the library. It was Xeroxed and it was put back in the library, right? But we don't. But when this came out, some people got excited about this because said, "Oh, there's an original edition," not knowing that there was an original edition before this edition, which seems to make it all the more complicated, right? But it later got reprinted as the Jesus Course in Miracles, right? Let's go on. So Jesus didn't really Jesus. Did I say Jesus? Helen. That was an interesting slip. Because Helen really felt as though it was Jesus. And if you read the Course, it's very difficult for you to read the Course and not say who wrote this, and not actually also come up to the conclusion that no body wrote it. It's just not some human being. Helen, and having known Helen, I can tell you, this is not the way she thought. Helen had struggles with the Course. She had difficulties applying the principles of the Course in her own life, but still she did it. I think, as you've heard me say in the past, that Bill Thetford and Ken Wapnick, I think, are the two who really got there. There were times that Ken said that he would explain the Course to Helen. So Helen got the Course, but still sometimes it needed. But I want to add that she really understood it and she could teach it. She never did really formally teach it, but for example, in the Foundation for Inner Peace edition of the Course, there's a part in the beginning that's called How I Came and What It Says. That is written by Helen. So that was written in 1977. The Course was first published on June 22nd, 1976. Helen's name did not appear on the Course at all until the second edition, which was in 1992. And Helen died in 1981, so 11 years after she was already gone, before her name even gets associated with. Of course, we knew who she was, etc., but there was no mention of that. And here's one of the, I keep throwing these books around. This is one of the first books that I had. This is the first edition. Not very little changes between that and the second edition, but I'll explain what changes there are. So Helen, after we met, which interestingly enough was just 5 blocks from where we are right now. I mean, it was 1 block off Park Avenue on 17th Street. We're 1 block off Park Avenue now. We're 4th Avenue is this extension of Park Avenue below 14th Street. Right after that, Helen became kind of an informal therapist for me. By informal, I mean we didn't have regular sessions. I never paid her. And a lot of the times it was just on the telephone. But there were times that I would see her but never in her own apartment. It was either in Ken Wapnick's apartment, which was directly across the street from Helen's. Ken deliberately got a studio apartment directly across the street just to make it easy for the two of them to get together. And very often they would work in Ken's apartment rather than in Helen's apartment. So she had this certain kind of clarity about her when I would go to her for counseling. I always felt as though what she was telling me was right, and that I should really pay attention to whatever it was that she said, and try to follow through with what she said without any trouble at all, really. So, for example, 2 things. This is a little bit about her counseling. She once told me that I must have a conversation with a young woman who was harassing me, and rather than my ignoring this woman, which I had been doing, and that was a loving thing to do. And so I did, and she was right. we actually resolved the troubles that we were having between us. And as I said here, we're still in conversation 43 years later, right? I mean, we're still friends 43 years later. Sometimes you just gotta deal with something that you don't want to deal with, but it's the thing to do is to deal with it and to get back to a resolution, right? Go on. Oops, do I need to go over here? Why is that happening? Huh? I don't know. Hit the.
Maybe you accidentally turned it off.
Oh, did I accidentally turn it off? I do that, don't I? That's what happened. It's got this little button right here, you know, and if you just, and you're constantly kind of rubbing that little button with your finger. All right, so it was interesting how Helen would counsel someone. She would often kind of leave the door open. For example, in another relationship that she told me I should let go of, the other relationship she said I should try to resolve, another one she said I should let go of. She said, if it's really important, you can always get together later on, right? That's just like leaving the door open a little bit, knowing, I think, very clearly that that would never happen, but it was just like a little solve to on the difficulty. So I did play some role in the publication of the psychotherapy pamphlet. So you may know that in addition to the course, there are two pamphlets that came from the same source of the course. One's called Psychotherapy, Purpose, Process, and Practice. And Helen had started writing that, but she had never finished it. And Ken at one point says, is there anything else? And she says, well, there is this pamphlet on psychotherapy. And what had happened was that in 1974, I was doing doctoral studies, and I wrote a letter that got published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology's newsletter, expressing interest in being in contact with anybody who was working in the fields of psychotherapy and spirituality. Bill saw my letter, reminded Helen that we had met previously in '73. Helen remembered that meeting. And he says, this guy is asking for this information. Why don't you complete the psychotherapy pamphlet so he can ask it, so he can have it? And of course, Ken and Bill were both after her for it to do that, so she finally did it. And then she called me in April '75 and said, I have something for you. I had no idea what she was talking about. In fact, I had changed my topic for my dissertation at that time, so I no longer needed that information. I was working on mysticism rather than psychotherapy. But you can find this discussed in Absence from Felicity on page 73 if it would interest you. The next person to come along was Judy Whitson. Judy, at that point, was Judy Scutch. And when Judy got the course, this is how Judy would have looked in about the time that I first met her back in, this is 40 years ago as well. We had been friends since the 60s. I think I told more about this. Judy lived in the Beresford. Anybody know where the Beresford is? Yeah. The Beresford is on 81st and Central Park West. Yeah, right. And she lived on the 5th floor, remember? And she was always having folks come over. She was very interested in parapsychological stuff. She was head of an organization that was called the Parasensory Foundation. And so I remember going to her apartment to watch Uri Geller bend spoons, which, you know, he would do just by lightly touching them and they would kind of fall over. And also to see the latest in Curlian photography, whatever it was. She was a kind of a salon for people who were interested in parapsychological stuff to come talk. So one of the first things that Judy did was to see to the creation of what was called the Criswell edition. It was called Criswell because that was the name of the woman psychologist or educator who put up the money, actually, to see to it that it got Xerox. So it was Xeroxed on a big Xerox machine. Keep in mind this is the mid-'60s, so it's at one of the colleges, one of the universities out in California, and they'd created 300 copies. So I had one of those copies and started working with one of those copies. There were a small group of us who did. Those 300 copies got spread out all over the country. I gave my copy to Tony Ponticello of the Community Miracles Center in 2015 because he begged me for it. So he could put it on display in a display case in his center out in California. So I thought, what the heck, if he wants it, he can have it, put it on display, get it out of my bookshelf. So we started working with that. Now the first hardback edition of the course, that would have been this edition here, was published on June 22nd, 1976. There was a gathering at Judy's place at that time, at which copies of this edition were handed out, at which point Helen said, I think you're supposed to teach this. And I went, no. What I meant by no was I didn't say no. I was just like, first of all, I was teaching at the New School University here with full load. I was working on a doctorate, and I was taking care of a church in Brooklyn. And the question was, I couldn't even understand it, let alone, I had to read this thing before you can teach it. And I just didn't have time, right? So, but as time went by, I hung in there and started reading it. And I didn't really begin to understand it until July of 1976, which I explain in the book Eternal Life in A Course in Miracles. At that point, I had a near-death experience in July of 76, so this is 13 months after the Course has been released. During that time, it really became clear to me that there isn't any world, that we're not bodies. If you have a death experience, it becomes pretty clear that you're not a body, right? That there's, it was an experience of stepping outside of time. And then what I call the four great illusions, which I've talked about here in the past, there's no world, which really means that there's nothing outside of you, that there's nothing external from you. What that really means is there's nothing outside of your mind, which really means that everything is dependent upon how we choose to see it. Projection makes perception. Helen talks about that in the introduction. So it's just really important to understand that. And then time is this other, as Einstein told us, it's relative, right? And the Course is placing emphasis upon our real relationship being a vertical relationship with the divine, rather than being a horizontal relationship. It has nothing to do with the past, and it has nothing to do with the future. The past and the future are both kind of illusions. I mean, after all, the past is past, right? And although it may seem to have an influence on who and where we are now, it certainly is not here now. In fact, as the more we move away from, say, our childhood or other past events, the more dreamlike those events may appear to us. And of course, we know nothing about the future other than what we project. We have two relationships in time. One is to guilt, which is a dominant fixture of the past that holds us in the past, and fear, which is the thing which pulls us into the future. Fear being, what if I get sick, or what if there's nobody to take care of me, or just what, all the what ifs. What if unpleasant things would happen, right? So, and then the biggest one, of course, of all is letting go of the story. I mean, that's one of the things that happens when we die. And you've heard me say in the past that there will be no John Mundy in heaven, simply because that's just a character who's walking around in space-time at the moment, but that's not eternity, right? That there is something which is eternal. That's your mind, which has been forever connected with God, which is why so much of the Course is really about remembering or recognizing or getting ourselves back home again. So the first conference that was held on the Course was held here in New York City on May 13th, 1978. Ken was there, Bill was there, Judy, Jerry Jampolsky was there, Saul Steinberg, and my friend Bruce Gregory and I were the speakers at that particular event. Helen, interestingly, was not there. And there was a very deliberate reason she was not there. She did not want to be, so to speak, on display. I like to compare Helen and Mary Baker Eddy because they both wrote these incredible documents which had a tremendous influence upon. They're very similar in the sense of talking about the power of the mind. They go off in lots of other places, but certainly on the power of the mind, certainly in terms of the power of the mind in terms of healing ourselves. So Helen she consistently turned down invitations to be on television. She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't go to radio shows. She wouldn't do interviews, etc. There was an article about Helen and the scribing of the course that appeared in the New York Times. I don't remember exactly what year that was, but back during the early years. And Louis, her husband's Bible was the New York Times. And he got very excited when he saw this article about his wife's. He never referred to it, A Course in Miracles. He always called it Helen's book, right? So Helen's book was in the New York Times. He didn't read the article. He was just excited about the fact that it was there. And one of the primary reasons she wasn't there is that there would have been no way she could have been completely anonymous, and to have been there, those of us who knew her would certainly have been talking to her. Other people would have seen that. They would have come. Now, she was very interested in how it all went afterwards and how many people had shown up. There were well over 300 people, I think probably close to about 350 people. By that time, the course was beginning to become significantly more known. It's just 2 years after the publication, just a month shy of 2 years, but already it was really getting around. So Helen died on February the 8th of 1981. Ken called me the next morning to tell me that she had passed and to tell me what kind of funeral arrangements were being made. I went to the funeral. It was held at someplace, I don't remember, it was at Columbia University, I don't remember that though. And I do remember it was a wood paneled room, and I remember there were probably 100 plus people there. Ken Wapnick did the eulogy, and about a half-hour eulogy, and at the request of Helen's husband, Louis, Ken never mentioned the Course in Miracles in the entire lecture. That was at his request. And I must also add that there were a number of colleagues of Helen's who were there. Maybe half the room were people that had known Helen professionally from Columbia who did not know about the Course in Miracles themselves. There were some of her colleagues who, as time went by, especially after she retired, then they didn't need to kind of keep it quiet so much. So they certainly knew about this, but a lot of people didn't know. So if Ken would have started talking about the Course in Miracles in a room where people didn't have any idea what it was about, it would have seemed a little strange. After the service, remember we drove. It was a cloudy, kind of rainy day in February to her gravesite. I don't know the name of the cemetery, but it's on Staten Island. That much I do know. I remember it was sort of a strange kind of thing because it looked like something out of an old black and white movie. By that I mean there were these iron rails around some of the graves, including where Helen was. And it's just like that. You can imagine something out of an old black and white movie with some sort of a strange music being played in the background, right? So By the way, I always really admired the way that Helen and Bill both kept out of the limelight when it came to the course. It wasn't that Helen didn't, not only that Helen didn't teach it, Bill never actively, he was certainly there, he was one of the speakers at the conference in 1978, but Bill retired early when actually a friend of his sort of did a study of his financial situation, and Bill was a minimalist, and by that I mean the less the better, so he wasn't a spendthrift. You can imagine he ate at the same restaurant every day. He was a bachelor. He was also homosexual, so he lived alone most of the time, right? I say it's very different from the way Mary Baker Eddy handled the writing of Christian Science, Science and Health with Guide to the Scriptures, because she got very, very, very involved in running Christian Science. You could actually be excommunicated from Christian Science. Can you imagine you couldn't possibly be excommunicated from A Course in Miracles? First of all, there's no church, there's no, well, there are a few churches now that have started based on the Course, but there's no hierarchy. There's no bishop, there's nobody up there that's top that could possibly, besides the Course teaches that we're all absolutely equal in the minds of God, and not only are we all equal in the minds of God, you should really learn in learning the Course that that's the way you want to treat each other, regardless of what this other person may have done, either to you, right, or just somebody that you know, right? People call me and ask me about how to handle, I got this one woman who calls frequently, says she hates Trump. She says, I hate him, I just hate him. And I said, well, you know, really the policy for a Course in Miracles student is don't let anything like this take the peace of God away from you. It's not about politics. It's not about the world. It's not about the outside. It's not about what's going on. That's a distraction. If you let yourself get caught up in that, in the world, in the politics of the world has always been crazy. So just let the world be crazy, and you look for sanity within your own mind. And it always will be crazy in that sense, in the sense of the egos that are running, that are in charge of power, the power guys who are running the world, so to speak, right? It's an ongoing soap opera that never ends, right? And it won't end. So Mary Baker Eddy, Paul and I were talking as I was driving in. When Science and Health came out, here's another interesting parallel. Science and Health was copyrighted in 1875 and published in 1876. So the Course in Miracles is written in, it's copyrighted in 1975 and published in 1976. So we have this 100 years difference. I think it's also sort of interesting that Helen was born in 1909, and she died, and Mary Baker Eddy died in 1910. So there's sort of like one thing is ending, and another thing is coming into existence, right? Mark Twain once made a joke. He made a lot of jokes, but Mark Twain, by the way, realized that this is not a real world, and he felt very frustrated with what he called the damn human race, right? He just saw it. But he didn't see any way out of this. Neither did Freud in terms of seeing a way out of the complexities of the ego. He thought you're just damned with that. So anyhow, Mark Twain at one point predicted that if things continued to the way that they were going in around 1900, by 1950, the whole world would be Christian Science. I mean, it was literally developing that rapidly. It was it was a whole new idea. It sort of fit in with the whole New Thought thing that was beginning to take over at that time. People were looking for alternatives to traditional Christianity. This one was capturing the mind, the power of the mind. And so folks really jumped onto that. If you go, any major city in the United States is going to have a Christian Science reading room. Unfortunately, Christian Science has been one of the more rapidly dying churches, along with all the other churches that are dying. That is dying as well. I think in good part, one of the major reasons is they don't have ministers. So there's nobody kind of going rah, rah, shish, boom, bah, let's go out there and build a church. What happens in a Christian Science church on Sunday morning is that somebody who is called a reader stands up and reads Mary Baker Eddy's writings, right? So that has limits on how exciting that can be, even though it's good, some good material there, right? That'd be like somebody standing up and reading the Course in Miracles, time after time after time again, without real discussion about it. There was no debate about it. Right? Hang on. So I might say that Helen could become quite judgmental. It was interesting being around her when she was in her judgmental state. Most of the time she was not that way. When I was around her, our relationship was more informal than that and more social. But she really did not like people mixing in other stuff with the Course. And there were people right in the beginning who were putting themselves up as the teachers of the Course, who were talking about things like chakras and auras and etheric and astral bodies and divas and devils, and none of that stuff is in the Course in Miracles. Right? There was one individual in particular, I will not mention this fellow's name, even though he died himself in the 80s. Still, there's no reason to mention that. And Helen just had a really hard time. Couldn't even be around him because of the way he was mixing New Age stuff in with the Course in Miracles. That's not what it said. You know, it's about healing the mind, and it's not about anything external. Ken relates a story in his book, Absence from Felicity, where Helen literally held her face in her hands and said, "My poor, poor Course," when she saw how it was being, as far as she was concerned, this is her baby, and her baby was being mistreated, so to speak, right? Misinterpreted, misunderstood. So go on. So now I have several points of interest here about Helen and the scribing of the Course. I already mentioned the first one. While Helen flirted with atheism, it could not be said that she was an atheist, but she kind of, you know, you can be an atheist that has a relationship with God, in the sense of why doesn't God take care of these situations? If there's a God, why doesn't He fix X, Y, Z situation, right? The answer to that, of course, in terms of the Course, is God can't, because you have this thing called free will. And free will is the thing that gets in there, and you gotta have free will, otherwise you wouldn't. It's a characteristic of divinity, which also means that we can screw things up, and God can't change that. He does, however, have a fix in. There's a fix that's been put inside every one of us, which simply means that it's someday you will wake up. You will wake up, and you will. It's like the ego seems to dominate, but there's a little spark in every soul that cannot go out, that is always there. So it's a matter of that little spark being kind of brought back into life again, and it doesn't make any difference how dark the soul is. That little spark is still in there, and given the right set of circumstances, it will come back. In fact, as the Course is trying to help us get back to the point where that is fully back into flame again, and you are being very receptive to the presence of the Holy Spirit in your life and to the guidance that comes from as you do the Course. I think as I've said before, you should actually find that you are leading, quote, a guided life. What I mean by a guided life is that more and more of the time you do know what the right thing to do. You don't have to think about it. It'll just automatically be given you. And it's, in some ways, it's so simple. It's amazing that we can go off course so easily. So Helen had several mystical experiences prior to her scribing of the Course, so this was not new. So here we got an atheist having mystical experiences. One of the ones that I kind of enjoy telling, there's a couple. Let me just tell you a couple of them in case you don't know them. If you've read Absence from Felicity, you know them. One that happened here in New York City. This was about 1939, so keep in mind, Helen's like 30 years old. She was born in 1909. She came from a wealthy family background. I think they lived on Park Avenue. They had servants. They had a cook. They had, she had a governess, etc. when she was growing up as a child, which in some ways also meant she didn't remember very many intimate times with her father. She could remember a few times when they actually kind of had conversations, but it wasn't like he was always there for her. In some ways, she was, her mother was there for her, but in other ways, she would be more related to the cook. More related. The cook was a Black Baptist cook, and she would sometimes take her to church with her, and she liked going to this Black Baptist church, in good part because of the enthusiasm, the singing that was going on, that kind of comradeship that comes with swinging and swaying and, you know, getting into what was going on. And then the housekeeper, not the housekeeper, her guardian, her governess, yes, thank you, was Catholic, and she would go with the governess to her Catholic services, but Helen, having a Jewish background, was prevented from going inside the church. She had to stay outside in the vestibule, but you can sort of picture her as a little girl looking through that crack in the door that led into the sanctuary, kind of fascinated with what's going on, that magical thing that's happening up around the altar where they're serving the communion, etc. So she was really kind of, and her mother too, at some point kind of flirted with Catholicism, trying to find something, never did. She probably got closer to Christian Science than anything else in terms of something that really influenced her mother. I'm talking about, not Helen herself. I think I've told you this story, but it's a fun story. So this is 1939. Helen was only took taxi cabs. She would not ride subways, but sometimes there was an event that she and her husband Louis had to go to. It was a long ways away. By then, I mean, a cab would have been very expensive. I think it was on one of the other boroughs. It wasn't in Manhattan. And so they took a subway, and it was also raining. It was snowing. It was snowing. It was, I think, in February. And this is a fun story. They get onto the subway. It's a disgusting situation as far as she's concerned. It's dirty. There's one woman across her whose baby is wiping chocolate on his mother's face. There is another mother who's trying to wipe the slobber or the throw up off of her blouse from her baby. As she sort of smelled like peanuts and garlic. There's some men who are fighting down at one end of the subway. There's a little boy who walks over and picks up some gum off of the floor and puts it in his mouth. And so this whole scene is like really disgusting to her. She would much rather have been in a taxi cab. But on Louis' insistence, they weren't. And so she just closes her eyes. She closes her eyes on to shut out the scene. And she said that what happened in the next minute, only lasted a minute, is that she sees herself walking down a path as a little girl, very much aware of the fact that it is her, comes into a clearing. There's a bright light in the clearing. There's a man who's sitting, a gigantic man, She goes over to this man, kind of like puts her head down towards his knee. He reaches out, touches her back. There's a flash of light all around. She opens her eyes, she looks around, and she has the most profound sense of love for every other person in that subway. She feels completely connected to every other soul who's there. She doesn't see any problems at all. There's no difficulty. There's only the love which is permeating the inside of this subway. So that's a beautiful description of a mystical experience. And that would have been, there are others, but that was a very exciting one. Let me just tell you one other mystical experience about Helen's. It's called the cave story. She has this, she had this vision where she sees herself on the side of it's like on the Mediterranean or something, and there are these caves up against the ocean, and she goes into a cave, and there is a scroll laying like on some rock on the cave, inside the cave, and she begins to unscroll, turn it to the right, the scroll, realizing that as she does so, she's seeing like hieroglyphic things or letters or scribbles, that she begins to realize that she's going to be able to read. And she turns, and this is going to enable her to see into the future. She starts going to the left and realizes the same thing, but this is going to enable her to see into the past. And she very quickly rolls the scroll back up to just the center, and she hears a voice say, "Thank you, you got it right this time." Now what's interesting is that second phrase, right? Thank you, you got it right this time. Right, so it's not looking into the past, it's not looking into the future, it's just God is. It's just right here. God is. That's all we need. All right? So, let's go on. So, she also began hearing Jesus speaking to her several months before she actually started scribing the course. And she knew it was like Jesus that was speaking to her, but this is not in the course because this is pre-course. By that I mean, this is prior to her hearing the words, "This is a course in miracles, please take notes," right? So prior to that, she began to hear a voice that was speaking to her. There was one particular incident in which she was looking for help with a friend of hers who was dying from cancer, one of her colleagues at work, and she got information about that. That is nowhere. I mean, that's not in any of the writings, etc. Right? This is just something that she was hearing pre-course. Also, I might add that Bill's impassionate plea to her, "There must be another way," occurred in June of 1965, but she did not begin scribing the course until October of 1965. So there was quite a bit of time in between there where she's beginning to hear, but it's nothing formal, and we don't yet have the phrase, "This is a course in miracles." Right? Go on. I think this is a very interesting point. When Helen began to hear the course, she later told Ken that it was more like her seeing the words in her mind, like a scroll. And what's interesting about that, and you've heard me mention this before, the Indian mathematician Ramanujan, by the way, see the movie about his life. It's have some of you seen the movie? You just saw it? Yeah, it's a really good, you get this impression. For those of you who may not know, a brief review, Ramanujan, who lived a very short life. Look at that. I mean, he very, 32 years old, I think, when he died. But he was an Indian, self-taught, autodidact mathematician who came up with all these theorems. He sent them off to Professor Hardy at Cambridge University. and some other professors there. One guy just kind of poo-pooed the whole thing. Another guy said that Hardy thought maybe there was something to them. They couldn't disprove any of the theorems. They didn't always know how he got the theorems, but they invited him to come to Cambridge, Cambridge, not Oxford, to maybe become a fellow there. And there was some trouble about him becoming a fellow there. For one thing, he had no interest in other subjects, only math. No interest in history, no interest in sociology, those kind of things. And they wanted somebody to have a broader perspective, but he was really kind of like Einstein. Did any of you watch the recent series on Einstein called Genius? I don't know if you can see this. It's been a wonderful series. It's on the National Geographic. You get a tremendous sense about the whole of his life. It's an 8-series production. Really, the guy who plays Einstein, especially the young Einstein, it does a marvelous job, and the woman who plays his first wife does a marvelous job as well. But Ramanujan could speak English, of course, and he could speak his Hindustani native language, but he could only really think in math. Now think about that. What it would be like if, to be so absorbed in thinking math that you could kind of only think in math. I remember Einstein at one point saying something about, and he didn't mean this in an egotistical way, but he said something to the effect that if you have no idea what I think about. There was no way that someone else could imagine the kind of where the mind, always trying to solve the riddle of the unified field theory, for example, or just first of all to find the theory of relativity and to prove that that was true, was a phenomenal reach for human consciousness. Well, Ramanujan's theories, as I said, 3,900 of them not disproved, and they finally pressed him to say, well, where are you getting this information? They actually had to force him to come up with proofs on some of the theorems, because otherwise they could just be made, but they couldn't disprove them. All right, so he finally says, well, all right, I'll tell you, God told me. It wasn't just God, it was the local Hindu goddess, who was native to the, Hinduism's got thousands of gods in that sense, right? Some of the local to a particular area that he grew up in. Well, anyhow, see the movie. It stars Dev Patel as Ramanujan. Dev Patel was the star of Slumdog Millionaire in 2009. This is 2015, and he's taller and looks like a scholar. Perfect person to be playing this role. Okay, so as I mentioned this earlier, the first message she received had to do with helping a colleague who was dying. Right? Helen took down her messages in shorthand, which was a blend of Gregg and Pittman, along with symbols of her own creation. Now, so this book here by our friend Robert Perry and the original Urtext, means original in German, has you can see in the beginning there's some pictures of some of her shorthand notebooks. I don't know, when I was in graduate school and college, I created shorthand too. Did you ever create your own shorthand? I mean, there's really no reason to, that was of, and that was that, and what was that. And words that were very common words, there's no reason to write them all the way out. So, but you would have to understand. But they were able to understand. Just a little bit of studying, you could figure out what that was. All right? So the first chapters of the original draft of the course were muddy, largely because it was clear that Helen was not a clear channel. And my favorite analogy is it was like, if you think of the body, if you think of her as being an instrument, and she did not know how to play this instrument very well. If you take an analogy of literally of a musical instrument, right? So as we progress into the course, she gets better and better and better at hearing, and therefore it's easier for her to not be confused about what she says or not have to ask Jesus over again, and not also to be bringing extraneous material into the course. Eventually got to the point where she became a maestro. By that I mean she never hit the wrong note at all. She was always in tune. So Bill Thetford and Ken, both Bill I think came up with this illustration. Ken used it. It was a very good illustration. That it would be like when you first go into an old house where the water's not been turned on for, say, several months, and you turn it on, it runs rusty. And then after a while, the rust clears and it begins to run clear. That would be similar to the, but I like my music illustration. So the course began with, this is a Course in Miracles, please take notes. What we have now, of course, is this is a Course in Miracles. It's a required course. What it means when it says it's a required course is that at one point each and every one of us will go through the same process that the course is talking about. There's nothing that says you've got to do the course. In fact, as the course says of itself in the manual for teachers, there are many thousands of other forms, all with the same outcome. And of course, we would expect there to be many thousands of other forms because there's thousands of other cultures and traditions and thinkings, ways of thinking. It need not be so complicated. I don't have a copy of it here, but now we also have a Course of Love by Marie Perron, which is similar to A Course in Miracles, which is more, I think of it in terms of kind of bhakti yoga approach to this understanding of the same ideas, whereas the Course in Miracles is much more of a jnana yoga approach to the material. Don't forget that Helen was an intellectual, Bill was an intellectual, Ken was an intellectual. It's a matter of sort of figuring it out. Other folks live more on a heart level than a head level, and that's another way of relating to. Actually, Judy Whitson at one point gave me a copy of the Course in Miracles to give to my mother, and I did, and I must say that Mother made a brilliant effort to understand it, but finally told me one day, she gave it back to me and says, I can't. I mean, she really tried, but she preferred reading the daily word in the Bible each day. She did. She would study. She would go the first thing every day. She would go and she would sit at her kitchen table all the time that I knew her, especially after we were grown. And she had a period of devotion every morning. And she gave it a try. But it wasn't her. She was much more heart-oriented. Go a little bit further with this. So in the beginning, when Helen would write down a principle, it would be followed by lots of discussion, which is what we find here in Robert Perry's edition of the Course. I must say that this is very interesting reading. At the same time, it's very interesting reading. I'm able to read certain passages. Well, it's no wonder they left that out. By that I mean, first of all, there's just some sentences that I actually said I have a local study group that meets in my home. A couple of months ago, we've been reading this, and I read a sentence and I said, I have no idea what that means. All right? So I had no idea what it meant. And so I never did figure that sentence out. So there were just sentences like that are in there, right? I may still go back and try to figure that out. So this is an annotated. When it says annotated, it means it's with annotations, that is comments. Robert does a really good job of cross-referencing this with the Bible. Helen understood the Bible. Helen spent a lot of time. Helen liked the Bible. She particularly, the King James Version in particular, that's the one that's quoted in the Course. The reason it's the King James Version is if you read the King James Version It does have a way of, it has a little bit more poetic quality. It kind of runs across the, even though there's the these and the thous and the those and etc., but it's got this more Shakespearean. Helen liked Shakespeare. Helen, by the way, was not a reader in the sense of like reading novels and stuff like that, but certainly she read Shakespeare, certainly she read the Bible, etc., more classical kinds of stuff. But there's not only these Bible references, there's other kinds of cross-references that appear in this book. If you want to read it, read it. It's very interesting. But it's unessential to understanding what the Course in Miracles is saying. So much of the original material was meant for Bill and Helen personally, including Helen with her relationship with Louis, her husband. They were a normal couple in that sense. Committed to each other, but of course they would run into difficulties. By the way, the last word that Helen said that Ken heard before she died was Louis. So that was the last thing that was on her mind, was her husband and her connection with him. So Jesus clearly told Helen that what was a personal nature did not belong in the Course. That you do find in the ur-text and in this, which is the ur-text, but it clearly didn't belong there. There was no reason to be having stuff about their relationship, about Helen's relationship with her husband, etc., in the Course in Miracles. That was not essentially what Jesus was saying. We don't need things in there which are not essential to the teaching. You know, it's not essential to the teaching of the Course. As I mentioned earlier, Bill was homosexual. There was information about his relationship with his friends, and this patently was not intended for publication. Okay, it's been published, but doesn't change much. Ken writes at one point, I think in Absent Felicity, Helen was notoriously inaccurate when it came to her own ego being involved. She was incredibly accurate when her ego was out of the way. Right, so that's just, and Helen had a way of kind of completely setting the ego aside, not in normal everyday life, but when it came to doing this work, she could get so focused and so clear that the ego was out of it. And you can tell in the ur-text when the ego is getting involved, when it's not. So Bill and Helen, of course, are both psychologists. And a lot of the original material was meant to link the Course with traditional psychology. And thus there's a lot of discussions about Freud and Jung and Rank and other psychologists that certainly does not appear in the Foundation for Inner Peace's edition, because it's not there. I realize that it's 2:45, which we would normally break point at this point. So why don't we do that? I've got several more slides about this before we get around to talking about the 50 Miracles principles, which we may get into only a little bit today. So let's take a break.